Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be asking, where is Israel at 70 as Israel is about to celebrate her 70th anniversary as a nation reborn? Warm welcome to the programme. And today's guest is Neil Lazarus from Awesome Seminars. Neil, you must be one of my few guests of the Middle East Report that has been there since the start of this programme, when this programme was launched back in 2011. So it's great to have you back on the programme.
It's always a pleasure to be here, and the programme seems to be getting popular and more popular. So it's great, especially on the anniversary of Israel. To be here and discussing what's happening in Israel.
Absolutely. And for our viewers, can you remind our viewers what you do? So
I work as a keynote speaker, traveling, talking about Israel, explaining about Israel. I also train people to speak about Israel in seminars and online on awesomeseminars.com.
And what were some of the challenges that you face in trying to educate people, inform people, but also to help people be ambassadors for Israel?
What it really is, the situation keeps changing. And if we have a look, maybe 10 years ago, everyone was talking about Israel and the Palestinians and the West Bank. Today, the real challenge to Israel is the beast from the east, which is Iran, and the threat on our northern border. The story and real threats to Israel today is on the northern border from Hezbollah and Iran trying to take over Syria. So how does someone who wants to talk about Israel keep updated, speak about Israel, and in many ways explain something which is very complicated in a very short amount of time?
And just very briefly, because I know that we did a programme a couple of years ago on how to be an Israel advocate and using social media and an ambassador for Israel. What are some of the key tips that you can give our viewers so that they can advocate for Israel?
One, make it personal.
Absolutely.
One personal story can explain 1,000 facts. Bring it home to the person. Make Israel real people. Make sure that they understand that an Israeli soldier is really someone's 18, 19-year-old son. Try and show the dilemmas and challenges that Israel have. Sometimes there's not right answers. There's some very painful choices. Use social media, I think, is another issue. Everyone today is on, whether it's Facebook, Snapchat, trying to spread those messages across. And you know what? To really do believe that despite everything, you can make a challenge. That one conversation you have, maybe at work over a cup of coffee, talking about the day's news, can influence and change people.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at Neil in action, and this is one of his seminars.
What I'm going to suggest today is that the Middle East is changing, and it's changing so radically, it's kind of hard to keep tabs with it. That wasn't English at all, but whatever. Keep tabs, what is that? I don't know, I speak English not good. So, very quick thing which is fun. Let's do a quick random thing. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you see the Middle East? Gentleman here, from the Netherlands, behind you.
Deserts.
Deserts, okay, that was good. What else? Someone else? Yes, lady here.
Islam.
Islam, okay. Someone else? Gentleman here. Arabs, Arab Spring. I love it. Whenever you ask Jews to look at the Middle East, they generally say two things. One is Arabs. The second thing they always say is Little Israel. Okay? I need you to stop being Jewish for a second. Okay? Stop fearing your mother and look in a slightly different way. I want you to look at it in a different paradigm. I had a group from Africa this summer. Great group. They were African, which is why they were from Africa. And they were laughing. I said, what are you laughing at? They said, well, whatever their straight lines, you know the British and French once were colonially. How brilliant is that? Because bottom line is, it never made sense. This region is changing. Anyway, so here's the thing. Here's the issue, which is this. If you have a look, there are three things going on at the same time, if you want to understand the Middle East. She's over there. Is this. One, Israel and the Arab world. Okay, and non-Arab world, because Iran's not Arab. Got to basically ask yourself, is it good for the Jews or not? That's number one. The second thing which you've got to get, what's happening with Iran? Now, we know, in layman's terms, there's the Sunnis versus the Shiites. We know that the Iranians are Shiites. We know that Saudi Arabia are Wahhabis, which are an extreme form of Sunnism. Reality is, how do you say on Facebook status? Is complicated. I put that on my Facebook status. My wife was so upset. All right? It's that delicate, the situation right now. But you've also got the Saudis. Yeah, it's not just Sunnis versus Shiites, because that's too easy. Look, for example, yeah, Shiites and Sunnis don't like each other, but they can do business when they're killing Jews or Americans. Or American Jews, that's even better. But there's something else going on. For example, Turkey. Turkey's also Sunni. There's a split within the Sunni world. The Saudis are pro-status quo. How do you say it in American? Status quo? Whatever. You guys killed the English language. I'm in New York. Say coffee. Coffee. Anyway, they're pro. The Saudis are pro-status quo. They're affected by the change in the Middle East. Turkey was very pro-Muslim Brotherhood. The defeat of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has set them back years. They see themselves as a superpower. What I'm arguing today is actually what's emerging is a Middle East where the borders are less important because the ethnic groups are more important. So you've got to tie the Shiites in Iran with the Shiites in Syria. You've got to wonder what's happening with the Kurds. Huge changes taking place. Don't tell anyone. About 3 weeks ago, the Israeli army picked up the phone to Egypt and said, doing a good job, guys, but don't get carried away. Don't bring down the Hamas regime. Why? Because if you bring down the Hamas regime, you would have what you have in Sinai today. Nothing and chaos. In other words, despite the fact that Hamas is very dangerous, we saw the weaponry, and now what they had before is like nothing compared to what they've got today. We know they're trying to kidnap soldiers. We had tunnels coming out. There's a sense of keep them under pressure, but don't collapse the regime. And I think that equivalent in many ways of thinking of better the devil you know than the devil you don't is there. As I say to my wife, be pessimistic, you're never disappointed.
I have to say I've experienced one of, or a few of Neil's lectures, and they're extremely good. One thing I love about your approach, Neil, is not only your sense of humour, but also that the audience have to get involved. They've got no other choice.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can't sit there just being bored by the Middle East. This is something which affects everyone. It's exciting, it's dynamic. I love those people who come in and say, like, you know, I'm not interested in politics. It's like, you put petrol in your car, you're interested in politics. You breathe, you like suffering from the climate, you're interested in politics. So really making politics a personal thing, and it's exciting. That's what I aim to do with my seminars.
Excellent. Now, we're talking about your favourite subject, my favourite subject as well.
Food?
That's, Israel, of course. And Israel is approaching her 70th anniversary as a nation reborn. Neil, where is Israel now as she approaches her 70th anniversary as a state?
It's funny. I think Israel has a split personality. On one end, Israel is 70 years old. So it has a nostalgia. It looks back. It can look back at its past achievements, like a 70-year-old. Yet on the other hand, I think it's got the mentality of a 21-year-old. It's young, it's vibrant, it's rebellious. It's like, I don't actually have to listen to everyone anymore, and can I have some money? And it's that combination of being 21 in mentality, but 70 years old in age, which I actually think is the secret of its success. If you have a look at Israel high-tech, for example, the spontaneity of Israel, the immigrants coming to Israel, adding. We don't have oil. You know, that's old joke about...
Have gas, though.
That's right. It's the old joke about why Jews don't like Moses, because we spent a generation walking around the wilderness to get to the only place in the Middle East that doesn't have oil. But we do have gas. You're absolutely right. But what's our national resource? Brains. And that's leading to high-tech and high-tech investment.
I mean, we look at Israel's population. Israel's population over 8.6 million, and 43% of world Jewry live in Israel. What does that say? And how long will it be before Israel becomes the most dominant nation, has the most significant number of Jewish people living in Israel instead of the diaspora?
Well, I think very much the Jewish history is being made and written in Israel. If we're a people of the book, there's a choice. Either you can read the book or you can write the book. And I think in Israel, we're writing the book of Jewish history. And I think that's the success of the state of Israel, the rebirth of the Jewish nation in Israel, in the Holy Land. And that's very much, I think, in a big picture where we are. We also have looked at, and one of our biggest successes, I would argue, is immigration. Taking immigrants, bringing an ingathering of Jews from all around the world and showing that you can absorb people and bring them in many ways to benefit a country rather than it would be detrimental.
Absolutely. And, you know, if we look at when the nation of Israel was declared by Israel's Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion on the 14th of May 1948, and then Israel was invaded by 5 Arab armies. To be fair, no one gave Israel a chance. I think it was on the front page of the New York Times that said, you know, the Jewish nation won't survive a week. And this was the same as US intelligence assessments. Despite that, brave and courageous men like President Truman voted and recognised Israel's right to exist. The early days were quite desperate days, weren't they?
Absolutely. Look, I think that the rebirth of Israel is a modern-day miracle in many ways. That despite everything, the state of Israel not only is created, but survived. But I think it's important not to start your history of the state of Israel in 1948.
Absolutely.
You know, we don't have Israel because of the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened because there wasn't an Israel. We need to get an understanding, and I think many of your viewers will, that the roots of the Jewish people go back thousands of years. Yep. This is a place where the prophets walked.
But that's what makes Israel so extraordinary, isn't it? The fact that, you know, this is your nation now, that you made Aliyah, you live in Israel, and that Israel has that blend of ultra-modern high-tech combined with this ancient nation that goes back centuries. And you see it all over Israel.
But that's the weirdest part, is you can drive through Israel, can sit in a traffic jam, and on one side, you know, you can drive through Tel Aviv, you'll see high tech, you'll see buildings, you'll see a modern city, a mini New York or a mini London. And on the other hand, you can drive 20 minutes away and you'll find people herding their sheep like they did since the Bible time. So it's really that old cliche, which I truly believe in, is Israel's the one place where you can use that Bible of yours as a tour guide. Because it hasn't changed. You can see where the prophets walked, yet at the same time have modernity. You can Google the roots of the prophets. Go figure that one out.
Let's have a look now at when Israel was declared as a nation back on the 14th of May 1948.
May 14th, 1948, 4 p.m. Tel Aviv. On a small podium stands a determined Zionist leader before a hastily convened gathering, reading out a proclamation which would change the course of history. This is how the State of Israel was born. First, a bit of background. At the end of World War I, the Allied powers gained control over the Middle East, including the land of Israel. The League of Nations recognized a historical connection of the Jewish people to their land and granted Great Britain a mandate to help them reconstitute a national home. However, Arab riots and geopolitical considerations led to a series of British restrictions on Jewish development and immigration. Even ships, including displaced children and Holocaust survivors, were sent back to Europe. Jewish resistance grew as well. By 1947, the ball was back in the United Nations Court, where a majority of the nations decided on November 29th, after a tense vote, to divide the land into a Jewish and an Arab state. The Jews rejoiced. The local Arab population, well, they launched a war throughout the country. May 15, 1948 was the date the British mandate officially ended, the date the Jewish state was to be declared, and the date 5 regular Arab armies planned a coordinated attack to annihilate the newborn state. On May 12th, David Ben-Gurion convened the People's Council. The atmosphere was grave. Moshe Sharet reported that the Americans are demanding a postponement of the declaration, or else they would not help Israel against the United Arab invasion. Golda Meir reported that King Abdullah had retracted his original agreement and will join the attack. Military leaders expressed serious doubts about the ability of the small Jewish community to withstand 5 regular Arab armies equipped with European weaponry. But somehow, after 13 hours of deliberations, Ben-Gurion succeeds in swaying the balance against the American demand. And on Friday, May 14th, in the presence of local Jewish leaders, he declares the establishment of the State of Israel. The proclamation, which was inspired by the American Declaration of Independence, asserted the historical and moral rights of the Jewish people in its historic homeland and defined Israel as a Jewish democratic state based on equal rights, freedom, and justice. The declaration ended with a call on Jews to return home and extended a hand for peace towards the local Arab population and neighboring Arab countries. The Arab invasion was immediate and lasted for over a year. Close to 50% of Israel's small fighting force were survivors of the Nazi death camps who vowed never again. 1 out of every 100 Jews living in Israel died in the fighting. But by the end of the war, the small Jewish state had emerged victorious as an independent nation in its homeland for the first time in 2,000 years.
Absolutely inspiring and incredible story. Neil, many of our viewers will be asking, and this is the complexity when it comes to Yom Ha'atzmaut, known as Israel's Independence Day. It's celebrated this year in April, and yet the 14th of May marks Israel's date of when the state was declared. Why are we seeing two different dates?
Why not celebrate twice?
Absolutely, of course, yes.
It's a reason to party. It's the difference between the Jewish calendar and the popular calendar or Christian calendar. It falls on 2 different days. So the earlier date is the date that it falls on the Jewish calendar. But hey, you know, it's a good reason to party for at least a month.
Absolutely. And to do it twice as well is
Absolutely.
always a good thing. So in terms of where Israel is at 70, I mean, Israel's population is reaching 9 million, is soon approaching the largest number of world Jewry living in the States. And also the other fact is that Israel is a modern high-tech nation now that is actually surpassing many European nations in terms of its GDP. And its impact in terms of information technology and technological breakthroughs is incredible, has the strongest military power in the Middle East, and yet Israel's still threatened by the likes of Iran. Israel's no closer to a peace treaty with the Palestinians, and yet the Saudis now are looking to normalize relations, and who would have thought that could possibly ever happen, even 2 or 3 years ago?
No, absolutely. There's a basic rule of the Middle East, which is your enemy's enemy is your friend. And one of the things which Israel perhaps didn't even expect with the signing of a nuclear agreement by the last Obama administration was the fear of a nuclear Iran wasn't only an Israeli problem. In Israel, we were in shock that America could stretch out its hand to Iran. The reality is, so was much of the Middle East. The Saudis today are more worried about Iran than they are the Israeli country. Many of the countries in the Gulf are more worried about Iran than they are, and a nuclear Iran than they are Israel. If you have a look, Egypt, for example, today is working with Israel. We're seeing joint action by Israel and Egypt in the Sinai together against ISIS. Today, Israel isn't placed, and that's the good news, isn't placed in a world in a Middle East which is surrounded by enemies. Today, it's much more complicated between those who support Iran and those who are threatened by Iran. And I think in many ways that is what brings Israel closer to many of its neighbors.
And also, I think the issue of Jerusalem is very, very significant because last year we had President Trump, who recognized Israeli sovereignty over Israel's eternal capital, Jerusalem. Also said that he would move the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And the latest news is that he is moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem to mark Israel's 70th anniversary as a birthday present to Israel. And we also hear the news that Guatemala has also then announced that they will move their embassy to Jerusalem. That's a major breakthrough, isn't it?
But the story isn't the moving. The story is the lack of reaction by everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, if you remember, we've discussed this before. Would what would happen if the Americans moved their embassy to Jerusalem? And many commentators were saying this is the beginning of a religious war in the Middle East, that the Palestinians will rise up, that the Arab world will attack Israel. This is the holy city. Look, if you look at what's going on the ground, yes, there is a rise of violence in the West Bank. There has been increased terrorism and terrorist attacks. But the reality is, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, there was a storm in Israel. It's an Israeli storm. It rained. And they called off the Day of Rage on Friday. Why? Because of the weather. This is on Jerusalem. This is the holy city. This is the battle for Al-Quds. Where are they? And it shows how weak they are. The Arab world, what did they do? They condemned Israel at the United Nations. Well, there's a surprise. Never seen that one again. United Nations is the only organization that I know who has an army which is camouflages. What beret? Do you know the color of their beret? Sky blue, so they can disappear into daylight when you need them. In other words, what? Absolutely. So what? That's the battle for Jerusalem. So in other words, it could be the case that Trump actually pulled their bluff, took Jerusalem off of the agenda. On the other hand, we have to see also how it's affecting other regions. For example, many of American Jewry are not supportive of Trump on a domestic issue. And I think that the American Jewish community, which is a very important Jewish community, just because of size, and I just came from the States, is in a dilemma. We support Israel. Yeah, do we support Trump domestically and internally?
I mean, talking about President Trump, his administration are filled with strong Christian Zionists, the likes of Nikki Haley in the UN, the likes of Mike Pence, his vice president, are strong and courageous Christian Zionists. Isn't there a realization now that Israel was diplomatically and politically, even militarily, isolated by the Obama regime? Now we have President Trump, who's into his second year in terms of his administration, absolutely hated by the liberal media in the States and by the liberal left, and yet he seems to be Israel's greatest friend. How do we bring that contradiction?
100%, and I think in many ways it's, and I come back to the point of the dilemma, especially for American Jewish community, between domestic and foreign policy. You'll see the majority of American Jewry, the American Jewish community, will support the Democrats, are more liberal in outlook, and they find it as a dilemma and a challenge with Trump, despite the fact that Trump is very, very supportive. So those are one of the real issues of today. How do you deal with a president in his relation with domestic and external policy? By the way, it's exactly the same with Obama. Many Jews in America were very supportive of Israel, and Obama was, as you exactly said, was against Israel in many, many ways. And there was a dilemma there. Should I support Obama? Do I support Israel? And that's been the story of Jewish communities, especially the American Jewish community around the world. In Britain, the test will come if Corbyn is elected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Corbyn is a dangerous man as far as Israel is concerned. He has alliances with Hezbollah. He has alliances with Hamas. He's called Hezbollah friends. What then is going to happen? If he becomes a prime minister of Israel, how does that fit in? Domestic versus foreign. And it's always been a problem, I think, of Jewish communities.
Absolutely. And talking about Britain and the likes of Jeremy Corbyn, he can't even mention the word Israel. I mean, I can only see that if he does come to power, then relations between Israel and Britain will deteriorate, despite the fact that trade between our two nations is absolutely at record high at the moment. And the cooperation between British defence and Israeli defence is also very, very high. And that essentially Britain and Europe need Israel in terms of protecting us from ISIS and other Islamic terrorist attacks.
Look, absolutely. If you look at, first of all, British internal politics, I'm going to upset someone. I know, I'm going to upset them, but British internal politics reminds me of the last 10 minutes of the film The Titanic. It's this once great thing in the Atlantic, slowly sinking, and the working classes are the only ones who are aware of it. So bottom line, if you have that, which will lead to the rise of Corbyn, I think Corbyn will get elected. Exactly what you're saying is what will happen in foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel. And yes, I think it is problematic. And if Europe generally was problematic, and Britain, perhaps after pro-Brexit, will be even more problematic for Israel. Absolutely. The question is how important Britain will be.
Talking of Israel's 70th, there's been an announcement that Prince William will visit Israel to mark Israel's 70th anniversary. Isn't this also a major breakthrough that a leading member of the royal family has decided to visit Israel, namely also the Palestinian Authority and also Jordan as well? Absolutely.
And I think it's a great decision, a great move, and I think everyone will be welcoming the prince, and it's going to be another party. We like to party in Israel, so I think there will be an opportunity for Israelis to discover tea with milk.
Which will be very good.
Absolutely.
And let's have a look now at this brilliant video in which two vloggers who explore places around the world have an amazing experience visiting Israel.
I'm Jess.
I'm Stephen, and we're Flying the Nest, and for the last 3 years we've been travelling and filming our adventures around the world. So if you are new here, make sure you hit subscribe. So Israel is one of the most unique and fascinating countries we have ever been to, because before we left to go on our trip to Israel, all our friends, family members, dentists, doctors said, "What are you doing? Why are you going to that country? It is so unbelievably unsafe." And looking online, we actually couldn't find much content on Israel. Everyone was saying you just should not visit this country. So we've decided to put together this video showcasing our top 10 favorite places and experiences to do in Israel. So if someone tells you you shouldn't visit this country, treat them off this video because it is unbelievably incredible and one of our favorite places to visit.
Number 6, dive in the Red Sea. Eilat is the perfect place if you love diving just like us. It is full of coral, beautiful fish and crystal clear waters.
So it's quite unique. When you're in the south of Israel in Eilat, you can see 4 countries just from the one spot. So this is Israel, Jordan, that is Saudi Arabia. Just behind it is Egypt. So number 5, when you're done in Eilat, head 1.5 hours north to Sakim. There you can stay in mud huts which were made by hand. We actually got the opportunity to volunteer there for a week and we helped construct the buildings. But if you don't have enough time, of course, you can just go down there and stay in the accommodation.
And I recommend also going for hikes around the area. There's some beautiful mountains. It's a perfect place to see the sunset. And it's just a really beautiful area in Israel.
Also, while you're on your hike, you can try find some shark bones because it used to be underwater, the area. Appreciate so much that we're here. We're walking in the Middle East, in the middle of the Israeli desert. What are we doing here, Jess? So number 4, and hear me out with this one, you can use Israel as a base to explore other Middle Eastern countries, which we personally did not know till we got there. You can spend about 10 days in Israel, but if you want to extend your time, you can do 2 or 3 day trips to Jordan to go see the lost city of Petra, or go and see the pyramids of Egypt in the west. So it's a really good base to have if you want to be in a safe country to use as a spot to then go and explore other countries. This is where they filmed Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and they blew it up. It was really cool. Really incredible being here.
3, visit the birthplace of Jesus. Now, the Nativity Church is quite a popular spot for Christians, as it is believed that this is where Jesus was born. Now, when we visited, we're quite the story. So what happened was, I recommend when you go, make sure you cover your legs, because I didn't expect that. I've never been to a Christian church where you can't wear shorts. So I was in shorts and someone told me I needed to cover my legs and I had nothing. So I thought I wasn't going to be able to enter.
But because Jess decided to not wear appropriate gear,
They lent me this to wear. And this old man came up to me and he had this old Baptist top. That's this really long t-shirt that you wear when you're becoming baptized. So he was like, borrow this, it'll cover your legs and you can enjoy the church. So I was like, thank you so much. Popped it on, went in the church. Now we were with a tour group and I got separated. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, I was being taken by a priest or a rabbi, taken because he thought that I'd entered to get baptized because I was in the full-on baptism outfit.
And he was speaking Hebrew. He couldn't understand Jess and Jess couldn't understand him.
It ended up me almost getting baptized, but then anyway, that didn't happen, but I got back with my tour group. But yeah, it was quite an interesting visit.
Even if you have no interest in the biblical stories, this is such a historic place in history. It is well worth visiting the Nativity Church in Bethlehem.
No, you have to go in. Here, borrow this. And I'm like, thank you.
So number 2 is an experience where I'm pretty sure we broke out in giggles. You can't even explain the feeling. So number 2 is floating in the Dead Sea, and honestly, you have to experience it. I don't think anyone can put into words
what
the feeling.
Like.
Yeah, you
like not being able to swim or like sink. It's so weird.
It has to be experienced in person. Also, the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point in Earth, is rich with minerals. So make sure you take mud and lather it all over your body because it's going to be such a good day spa care for you while you're down there.
And it's free.
And it's free, yeah.
Dead Sea mud is really expensive, so while you're there, make sure you take full advantage. And number 1, you have to go and explore the old city of Jerusalem. It is one of the most unique places we have ever been to.
So there are multiple religions taking up different quarters in the old city. You can walk in through one entrance and be in the Muslim quarter, take a left and you're in the Jewish, take a right, you're in the Christian quarter. So it's so interesting just to walk around as a cultural perspective. So there are so many interesting places to visit in the old city of Jerusalem. Of course, the Dome of the Rock is there, including the Wailing Wall, which we went to during Valentine's Day. So that was so interesting to see because there were hundreds of Jewish people coming down to the wall. Another major one is the Holy Sepulchre Church. Now this is believed by Christians where Jesus was actually crucified. This is where the cross was placed, where Jesus was crucified. So you can see where the cross was placed, including Jesus' final resting place. It is so interesting to go in there, and the architecture itself is just fascinating. The sun is set, so all the marketplaces are shut up. It's actually quite a beautiful time to be walking around Jerusalem because all the tours have left, everyone's kind of closed up, and there's like a bit of quiet.
So I hope this video has convinced you that you need to go to Israel.
And if you've never been to Israel, what a brilliant time to go and visit Israel for her 70th anniversary as a nation reborn. I love that video, primarily because, you know, here is 2 young vloggers that have visited loads of different destinations around the world. Their friends and everyone they know, when they tell them they're going to Israel, are horrified that they're going to Israel. Why visit this place? It's dangerous, it's not safe. And yet you can hear from their own words that this is one of the most amazing places they've ever been to. And there's no spiritual connection with Israel. There's no political connection. They just wanted to visit Israel to see it for themselves.
And I think that that's the beauty of Israel, is you can take whatever you like from it. If you're coming from a religious perspective, you can walk in the footpaths of Jesus. On the other hand, if you're not particularly religious and just like history, you'll find enough history there. I love it whenever they dig up roads in Israel. It's hysterical. It takes such a long time because they dig up the road and then discover another synagogue of a few thousand years old. So it's got everything for everyone. If you like to party, there's Israel. You could go to Eilat. You'd like to ski? And the same time as scuba dive in Eilat, you go up north and you can ski in the Hermon. So it's a country which has everything for everyone. And I think that that's a great place to visit.
And also, in terms of Israel advocacy, surely one of the greatest thing anyone can do, surely, is to actually visit Israel itself and experience the joys of being in Israel, the food, the culture as well.
Absolutely. And what I would encourage your viewers to do is to book early, because it is packed. There's an irony going on. You turn on the news, you turn on the BBC, whatever, you would imagine, I don't know what you would imagine, but I wouldn't go there. The reality is that the hotels are packed, the tourists are coming. As I came to England, I flew out, I got a few hours early at the airport, as one does, and At Ben Gurion Airport, you're just watching masses upon masses of people arriving to celebrate Israel, Jerusalem, and the modern country of Israel, and the historic country at the same time.
Absolutely. What is it that attracts so many different visitors from all over the world to visit the Holy Land? What is it about Israel that seems to attract so many people to actually be in the land and see the land?
I think it's a country which has everything for everyone.
Yeah, it's a good answer.
In other words, it's interested in history, we have history. Interested in sports, we have sports. Whatever you want from a holiday, whether it's intellectual, whether it's religious, whether it's just fun and sun, we have it in Israel. So it very much appeals to everybody. And as the video also said, if you like to travel and you're traveling a long way to come there, it's also a springboard to other countries in the region you can visit as well.
Absolutely. In terms of Israelis themselves, I mean, 70 years old is quite well, it's actually quite a marker to actually reach in terms of Israel's history. That Israel's faced 5 major wars in a very, very short history. There's that constant threat of terrorism, that constant threat of regional war. And yet, despite this, Israel's flourishing, the Israelis are flourishing. How are Israelis viewing Israel as she approaches her 70th anniversary?
Well, it's interesting because you talk about history, but there are many people in Israel, like anywhere else in the world, that don't have a knowledge of collective history. I work with 70-year-olds and 17-year-olds in my seminars. So if I speak to a 17-year-old Israeli, their memory of the past, they don't remember 48, they don't remember 1967, they don't remember 9/11. So their understanding may be based perhaps on their family's stories of the Second Intifada. You speak to someone who is Israeli and 25, 26, maybe 30, they grew up in the period of the peace process. They're the Rabin generation. They're the signing with Jordan. Someone who's older, I have a friend who lives not far from Gaza and he's in his 60s. As his childhood memory, he remembers getting his bicycle fixed in the Gaza Strip as an Israeli. Wow. So depending on what generation you enter the story of Jewish history in Israel as an Israeli, you have a very different collective memory of what's actually happening.
In terms of Israel's relations with the world, I mean, we've seen over the last year that Israel's relationship with India is flourishing, Israel's relationship with nations in Southeast Asia flourishing, including Africa and China. But more the old traditional allies, such as Europe, we're seeing that Europe is taking not so much individual European nations, but the EU collectively is taking a very hostile position, particularly as President Trump has made Jerusalem the dividing issue. We see that the United States is backing Israel, but Europe is backing the Palestinians.
I think that that's been traditional in many ways. We've seen, depending who the President of the United States is, Europe positioning itself as a counterbalance. Under the Obama administration, Europe, I think, was less significant because they found an agreement with the American foreign policy. If America is more supportive of Israel, then the Palestinians seek to push a counter policy. But again, one of the things which I think is important to point out, especially when we talking about Israel and advocacy, for want of a better word, is not to make it a win-lose situation. It's not either the Israelis or the Palestinians. It's people who are seeking peace, both Israelis and Palestinians, versus extremists that don't. And I think that that's an important message to get across as well, that actually it's beneficial for both Israel and the Palestinians to make peace. And there are people on a lower level, or on a people-to-people level, which are discovering it. I live on the border with the West Bank, and I just had to get my car fixed, my tire fixed. So I went into the West Bank and I went into a Palestinian garage. I said, I need my car fixed. So he said, no worry, come, sit down, have a cup of coffee. So I had a cup of coffee. One of the guys, Mohammed, was changing the wheel. Then this ultra-Orthodox Jew, mega Jew, Haredi Jew, comes in and says, could you help me? And he says, after this gentleman. So he says, no worries, come, sit down. So there was me, Jewish with a sneaking admiration for non-kosher Chinese food. Ultra-Orthodox Jew. And 3 Palestinians drinking coffee, watching Mohammed change the tire. And then someone said, the discussion was, does God exist? I wish I'd filmed this so you could put it into the program. And often there was this discussion and this it's not friendship, but the need to continue life despite the conflict goes on. You're going to see trade between Palestinian villages and Jews living in the West Bank, selling things to each other. And that doesn't make the news. I have many Palestinian colleagues, many Palestinian friends, and we put politics aside. Okay? And actually we find we have much more in common than most people think. After all, we are first cousins.
Absolutely. So when it comes down to the Palestinian position, the Palestinian leadership will obviously cry Israel's 70th anniversary as a state, and we're seeing that they're now coming into a national unity government with Hamas, and Hamas is a genocidal terrorist organization, to oppose President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem, as well as the embassy move and the potential peace plan that he wants to unveil as well. Isn't it more the case now that the Palestinian opposition to Israel is leading them to be even more isolated, even with their own region, and also with the Arab states as well?
Well, first of all, I challenge your assumption that this coalition government between Hamas and Fatah is really working. What we saw was the sticking point, that Hamas was unwilling to give up arms to Fatah, that they insisted that they would have their own military under Fatah. By the way, it's interesting to make analogies, because under Israeli independence, there was the same argument.
Yep.
Ben-Gurion's statement was to split off groups such as the Lehi, we're going to have one army, one country, one people. If you remember, some of your viewers may be familiar with the Altalena, a boat carrying arms to one ship. Ben-Gurion's statement as the leader of the Jewish people was, when you're creating a state, one army, one country, one people. And that's a discussion which is going on with the Palestinians, and they failed to do it. Because the Palestinians, as we know, never fail to miss that opportunity, and they do it yet again. They're saying, no, Hamas will have its own weaponry, we're not going to give it up. So I'm very dubious whether this coalition or idea of coalition will get together. Palestinians are at the moment are in a weak position vis-a-vis Trump, and they're desperate to try and make some gains.
Absolutely. And also the fact that President Trump has also announced that, if the Palestinians continue to whinge, continue to moan, that he would actually then threaten funding to the Palestinian Authority.
Absolutely. Look, we're now getting finally a change and reckon on the policy that the Palestinian Authority is funding terrorists. In other words, for many people, it's more profitable to commit a terrorist attack and then get paid in jail by the Palestinian Authority than anything else. That can't continue to happen, and I think that that's a change we're seeing in the foreign policy of America, together with what you mentioned, the United Nations. Finally, people are saying enough is enough.
Absolutely, particularly with the likes of Nikki Haley.
Absolutely.
As America's ambassador to the UN. So when it comes to the Middle East, as Israel's 70th anniversary, there seem to be three major trends going on in the region, and three alliances merging. One is the Iranian alliance, and we see Iranian domination over Iraq, into Syria, propping up Assad's regime, with the likes of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah fighting in that really terrible civil war, and also Hezbollah and Iranian control of Lebanon. On the other hand, then we see this strong alliance of the Muslim Brotherhood with Turkish involvement with Qatar to push the ideals of the Muslim Brotherhood and to have Jerusalem recognised as the future capital for the Islamic Caliphate, pushed by President Erdogan of Turkey. And then as a counter-alliance, we see that Israel has strong relations with Egypt, with Jordan, with some of the Gulf states, including Saudi, to block this Iranian Muslim Brotherhood alliance. Is that a fair assessment?
No, absolutely. And I think in many ways that's the dilemma that Israel's facing. Those borders which were very much defined in the Middle East by imperial powers are no longer relevant. To really understand the Middle East, don't look at the borders. Look where the Sunnis are, look where the Shiites are, look where the Kurds are. And the threat, I keep coming back to this because we'll talk about this when I'm back next year, is the threat is from the north. We're seeing intelligence coming out this week, Israel publishing a photo of another Iranian base in Syria. Now that's a message by the Israelis, which is, we know it's there. Israel's red line to Iran is, we will not allow you to set up base in Syria. And by showing that satellite photo, it's the second time. The first time Israel blew up that base. It's a very clear message to Iran. If Iran gives weapons to Hezbollah, which Hezbollah could then fire to Israel, is dangerous. If Iran is enabled and allowed to produce weapons in Syria without having to transport them from Iran, it's a different story. It's a game changer. And I think that that's really what is concerning Israel today.
So do you think that in the near future we could see a war between Israel and Iran in Syria? Also, we've had the likes of Naftali Bennett last year warn about the potential danger of a conflict with Hezbollah emerging, and the fact now that Hezbollah have about 160 to 180,000 rockets and missiles based in southern Lebanon, targeting Israeli towns and cities. Could we be months away from the next conflict?
I never tried to put a timer on politics and events in the Middle East because they can happen very quickly, or that they can take years. Sometimes individual events trigger actions. But absolutely, the story is in the north of Israel, because you have Hezbollah, a remarkably dangerous organization, being used by Iran. Iran seeking to take over Syria. Iran already having effectively taken over Lebanon with Hezbollah. The next war will be a very dangerous war because of the amounts of weaponry that you suggested, the quality of the weaponry. In other words, Hamas 3 years ago had 9,000 rockets. They fired around 3,000, 10% landed on their own people. The most they fired at one time was around 36 on one day. Hezbollah can fire 1,000 at a time. They can aim. They can aim at buildings, they can aim at cities, they can aim at nuclear reactors. So it's a very, very different story. Also, the connection between Hezbollah and the Lebanese army. Today, Israel is saying that, and correctly so, that they're acting together. So a war with Hezbollah will be a war against Lebanon, it would be a war against Syria, and it would be, long-term, would be the war against Iran. It will be Israel fighting Iran in Lebanon and Syria.
Could we see the prospect of a future war which Israel's engaged in fighting against the Iranian regime, engaged in fighting against Hezbollah, and finding that they're joined forces by the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and also the Saudis, who also feel very threatened by the Iranian Shia crescent?
I would be surprised to see Egypt and Saudi Arabia physically siding with the Saudis, perhaps. I mean, the Saudis are... But I would be surprised. What you would probably see is that Israel being allowed to have airspace to fly over those countries. Even today, there's discussion about whether El Al, the national airline carrier of Israel, can fly over Saudi Arabia. So I think it's intelligence, it's flying over capability, not physical attacks. But I wouldn't rule it out, especially with Saudi Arabia. I remind you that pro-Iranian allies from Yemen fired at Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely. So we're down to the last 5 minutes of the programme, Neil. As we celebrate Israel's incredible achievements over the past 70 years, how can our viewers be ambassadors and advocates for Israel, and what can they do?
Number one, come visit, and 3, come visit, all right? They're the 3 number ones. Come visit, come celebrate. If this is the year to come, then definitely come. I always love it. People always say next year in Jerusalem. Why don't we say this year in Jerusalem? Why don't we say this summer in Jerusalem? So number one, come. 2, if you can't do it, but you have children, send your kids to come and visit Israel. There are many, many groups, including, by the way, today, there's a Christian birthright group for Christian students who can come if we're talking about a younger generation. Second of all is to be vocal. Get online, talk online, use whatever means of social media you can do to talk about Israel and answer back. The difference between writing to our editor at a newspaper and writing it online is the next day someone's thrown away that newspaper. Online, it stays, and it continually stays. So get online and be vocal. Thirdly is don't tolerate anti-Semitism. Somehow, especially in the Labour Party today, there's this debate, well, we're not sure if it's anti-Semitism, it is anti-Semitism. Denying the Jewish people a right to their nation is an anti-Semitic move. And we should have a zero tolerance for it. Spell it out. So stand up, be tall, and stand with Israel.
Absolutely. Neil, as we look beyond Israel's 70th anniversary, can you just share with us some of the absolutely incredible and remarkable achievements that Israel's making to humanity as a nation that is rightly so a light unto the nations?
I think that one of the most exciting things is if you look in medical advances within Israel, whether we're helping to develop cures for people who can't walk, for cures for people who can't see, whether we're fighting cancer, the real move of technology in many ways, which I think really affects the lives of many children, of many parents with perhaps sick children, is in the advancement of technology and medication together. But it's amazing. I come back to where we started, from a country which the prophets wandered around, to today, a country which sells technology to the United States of America, and America buys it. That's the true history and the passage of the Jewish people in their land, in Israel, after not 70 years, but thousands of years of Jewish history.
Absolutely. What does it mean for Jews in the diaspora to know that Israel is there, and Israel is always going to be that insurance policy, that Israel is the home to the Jewish people, that despite the age we're living in, and we're seeing, as you rightly said, sadly, an alarming rise of anti-Semitism across the world, that Israel is that safe haven. What does that mean for the Jewish communities in, say, Britain and Europe?
You see, again, I don't like the concept, and yes, it is a concept which perhaps even originates from some of the Zionist thinkers, Herzl, that Israel is just a safety haven for Jews. Israel's much more than that. It symbolizes Jewish history. It's not just a safe place. The relationship between Israel and the diaspora is a relationship of family. Sometimes family is annoying, sometimes family we love, sometimes family we yell and shout at more than we do ever before. But at the end of the day, it's our bloodline, it's our family which we're born into, and that's a Jewish history.
Neil, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest as we mark Israel's 70th anniversary as a nation reborn. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. I think all of us can celebrate Israel's historic and incredible achievements over the past 70 years, knowing that Israel is a nation born out of prophecy. And in our day, we have seen Scripture come alive, but also knowing that Israel is a vibrant democracy that is a light unto the nation. So we'll leave you with this beautiful song, the Hatikvah, as we remember Israel's 70th anniversary.